Hi everyone, thanks for joining us for our pre-concert video for Holland Symphony's October 4 concert, which we're calling Heroes and Villains. There's definitely a hero involved, or at least a heroic piece, and a villain or two lurking in the background of the music of this concert. So I often like to start out by asking Johannes how he came up with these three pieces, what made him put these three pieces together. He always drafts programs, and then we have a committee that works on it, and we have a lot of fun talking about um, artists and music and what belongs together. But I'll start off by asking Johannes, why these three pieces? Maybe I know this is kind of your last full season with us, conducting all the concerts, so we're doing a lot of your favorites. Oh, maybe which piece did you pick first for this concert, and then how did you build the rest of the concert around it?
Yeah, so I'm often asked like what's my, favorite composer and, partially I'm a conductor because I like the variety. So I wouldn't necessarily say that these are three of my favorite pieces, but I mean, I love all my children equally. So I do like classical but also romantic repertoire. So it was time to do Eroica again because it's been a number of years for us. And I particularly like the symphony. It's challenging for the conductor, so I do like the challenge. But I also like that there's so much drama and so much musical action with a relatively modest orchestra, right, in terms of size. So it's easy to make, big colorful statements when you have a huge orchestra on stage, but to have a program that's a bit pared down and then have, big musical meaning. That's something that I strive for. So Mozart and Beethoven goes really well together. There's a lot of drama in Don Giovanni Overture, so I knew those two would go really well together. And then I needed to add some spice, something that's not classical, something that has a little tonic variety. And I do like the two Prokofiev violin concertos. I've done the number one before, but that seemed a little tame. And I knew I wanted to work with Moni here in California, but also in Michigan. So I thought, what concerto would go well with him? And sort of his personality lends itself, I think, perfectly to that second concerto. It's a new piece for him. So when I told him a year and a half ago, he started learning it. So, and I think he really enjoys it. And I think it's while while not being too dissonant, I think the orchestra it's perfectly accessible, but it's not predictable. So I think that second concerto will add some tonal variety to this program. So I think that just makes a really, really fun program. Not necessarily because they're my three different, favorite pieces, but I think they go really well together. Yeah. So should
Yeah,
we start talking a little bit about the Mozart maybe?
go for it.
Okay, so Don Giovanni, it's full of drama, right? It's one of the big three opera serias that he wrote, along with The Marriage of Figaro, um, and Così fan tutte. So there is, even if you don't know the drama, there is so much action, right, in Don Giovanni. So it opens up with these, sort of dark, tones that, harken back to the Commendatore, the one which Don Giovanni killed and the one that, eventually is going to drag him down to hell. So it opens, with huge drama like this. And then we get this perpetual forward motion that Mozart is so famous for. Um, but like it almost resembles, Don Giovanni, who can't help himself but like go on with this behavior about just like turning women into conquests. But it all sort of ends badly for him. And Mozart actually did not want, a happy ending at the end of the opera, but he was made by society. They said, "Hey, you can't leave the piece like this. There needs to be a happy chorus at the end." But it's sort of a weird thing. That's how this opera ends. It really should end sort of with despair and drama. But what this opera is really known for, and especially the overture, is that apparently the story goes that Mozart was partying all night and that he, didn't finish the opera, the overture, until just a few hours before the premiere, and copyists, the ink hadn't dried yet when they started the overture to perform the opera. So the overture was the last bit of, music that he wrote. A lot of people think an overture is written first because it leads into it, but actually he wrote the opera first and then the overture as sort of a compilation of themes that then sort of sum up the opera in this little gem. So it's kind of a perfect overture, and it goes really well with our title Heroes and Villains, because both of that is in there. So it's just a really fun action-packed overture to open this concert.
Yeah, we're definitely starting with the villain. Um, yeah, I would not want to have to sight read the overture at a performance. But yeah, apparently he turned in the parts. He turned in the score to the copyist at about 7 o'clock in the morning. His wife had to keep him up all night to finish writing it. So for those of you who've seen the movie Amadeus, the beginning of this overture are some of those really dark chords um, that we hear in the movie soundtrack. Whenever the sort of the father figure, the judgmental father figure appears in the scene. If you know that soundtrack, you'll recognize the beginning of this overture instantly. So it's very powerful. It's going to be a striking way to open a concert. Ominous, but most of the overture is really happy and joyful, and maybe it's supposed to be a little bit like what Don Giovanni's sort of you know living in the moment, living large, pleasure-seeking character is like. It's fun. It's just kind of a fun romp. It's great music. Yeah, after that, then we turn to the Prokofiev Second Violin Concerto. I've liked listening to both of these concertos for years. I have not played either of them, either the solo part or the orchestra parts, so I'm pretty excited to do this. His first concerto is in D major. It's much lighter. It's a little bit more virtuosic, at least on the surface. The second concerto is a little bit more brooding, perhaps you might say more melodic. And so Prokofiev was born in a Ukrainian village, and learned to play piano at a young age, very influenced by Tchaikovsky. And I think a lot of his compositional life is was sort of a infatuation with Tchaikovsky, move away from Tchaikovsky, and then a return to a lot of Tchaikovsky. But yeah, learned how to play Tchaikovsky's music. That's mainly what he played on the piano as a young boy. Really liked Tchaikovsky when he went to school. Then, let's see, in the early 1900s, 19 teens, especially when the Russian Revolution was happening, like a lot of other composers, really turned away from a lot of what was very romantic and lush, and especially that really, really late romantic Russian music was just sort of over the top in just glorious, wonderful romanticism, late Tchaikovsky, and even like the Rachmaninoff Symphony we played last year. So Tchaikovsky kind of took a hard turn away from that. Had a very sort of sarcastic style, a lot of dissonance, angular. I think like a lot of composers and artists reacting to the politics of the time really turned away from a lot of that beauty and tried to find ways to express some things that were really hard. He sort of started. He left Russia, or what became the Soviet Union. Lived in various European cities. Lived in the U.S. for a while. Also, sort of following in Tchaikovsky's footsteps, composed a number of ballets and operas. Did some film work, film soundtracks. In the 1920s, sort of took a turn back toward a little more what we might call traditional style. Melody became much more important again. And maybe we might even say melodies that sound a little bit like Tchaikovsky, just beautiful singable melodies that get stuck in your head. For the most part, he didn't really adopt Tchaikovsky's really thick, lush, romantic style and sound. Often had more of a classical size orchestra. Actually, the orchestra for this concerto is fairly small for the time that it was written. It's much more of a Mozart sized orchestra, at least in terms of the woodwind and brass forces that are required. Although he does use some interesting interesting percussion instruments. It was written while he was on tour with a violinist, European tour, and actually premiered in Madrid. So pretty heavy use of castanets, which maybe gives it a little bit of a Spanish flair, especially in the last movement. Um, so very, very classical in a way in its forms and in its texture. Beautiful melodies. Some of really his most beautiful melodies. He wrote this at the same time he was writing his Romeo and Juliet ballet. So it's got a lot of that flavor, both in the melodies and sort of the heartfelt emotion that we can hear in these melodies, but also especially in the second movement, just the interchanges and the back and forth between the soloist and the orchestra. It almost has sort of that Romeo and Juliet quality. Really fun piece. The last movement is kind of this wonderful dancing style, little bit of a Spanish flavor. Um, let's see, I was about to say Tchaikovsky, but Prokofiev moved back to then the Soviet Union in 1936. This piece was written in 1935. This was his last piece he wrote before he went back to the Soviet Union. I think that was during the Depression. It was a pretty hard time to stage ballets and operas and those huge pieces in the US and in Europe. I think Prokofiev thought things would be simpler for him as a composer in the Soviet Union. Unfortunately, that was also the time that Stalin was really cracking down on art and music, and Prokofiev, like all the other composers, had a hard time writing within the requirements that were strictly enforced by the government. Music that should be uplifting and patriotic and not too complicated and not too Western. But so meeting those standards without getting censured, and he, like a lot of other people, did get in some trouble later on in his life. Interestingly, died the very same hour that Stalin died, had a stroke. And the story about him is that no one could find any flowers to bring to his funeral because every flower available was, sent in Stalin's direction. So really kind of died, almost forgotten. Almost no one went to his funeral because everyone was focused on Stalin. But wonderful music. We played Peter and the Wolf back in August, so it's kind of fun to do that piece and then come to the violin concerto. Some similarities in the language, different goals, but just a fun, slightly quirky composer. Very melodic, very tonal language, but with a lot of surprising chords and surprising shifts. So thanks for having us do this. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, everybody knows the first concerto, but very few perform the second one. And I think the first time I heard a recording of it was with Gil Shaham, and he just plays it so well, so warm, and there's something really personal about it. And yeah, it fits the orchestra perfectly well for Eroica and Mozart. So it's very rare that a composer's second concerto would use fewer forces than the first concerto. So it's definitely a more inward look. Yeah, it's
Very, yeah,
open sort of
very
haunting.
introspective.
Yeah, open sort of haunting and has this sort of like ambiguity that's just really wonderful. Yeah.
Mhm. That's my favorite recording too.
Hmm.
So then Beethoven. Okay, Johannes, how everyone talks about this symphony as being the symphony that ushered in the Romantic era, the symphony that changed, one of these really pivotal turning point pieces of music that sort of changed the trajectory of classical music from that point onward. Um, how would you describe that, or what makes this piece what makes this piece earn that claim from people, or how is it different to you?
Yeah, so of the nine symphonies, a few symphonies really stick out as sort of groundbreaking. We think of Beethoven 9, with the addition of choir, or Beethoven 5, the Fate one. But it's really number 3 that started this. So Beethoven 1 and 2 are a little bit more classical, sort of in like a Haydnesque tradition, but pushing the boundaries. But this one, got a really difficult reception when people first heard it. The number one thing they said is too long because it's 47 minutes long. I mean, it's like, and if you play it a little slower, it can go above 50 minutes. So that was just unheard of, something this long. And so it sounds a little bit, it's unique, also in the way that he dedicated this to Napoleon first. So it seems like, not conventional, but more like individualistic. So, he wrote this to, for Napoleon, who changed, the direction of politics in Western Europe. But he also like, here is, I'm Beethoven, I have something unique to say, right? I'm not going to just like write symphonies, like one and two, just keep on writing, but like I, want to do something new. So in terms of instrumentation, there's a really groundbreaking thing that happened. He used one more horn. So instead of the usual double winds, which included horns, now you have three horns. And so what that enables you is to do harmony, right? Because you can have chords. A triad consists of three pitches. So all of a sudden, the horn sort of came into its own a little bit more, and then it wasn't long until we added a fourth one, and then we have this sort of virtuosic, horn section. So I would say palette in terms of more harmonies possible with the addition of the third horn, and then size, right? The length. Um, but then also like there are these ginormous codas that he started to do. So they're like mini sonata forms within the coda. So even form-wise, he's pushing boundaries on all different ways. So when we think of the Romantic era, we don't necessarily think of symphonies in traditional forms. Brahms was kind of the outliers, but the people who really pushed forward were like Wagner and Liszt and Berlioz and these people. And Beethoven made it possible by pushing the form so far out that, the jump to uh, doing a tone poem instead of traditional sonata form wasn't that wide, wasn't that much of a leap anymore. So he enabled all those people that came after him by just pushing boundaries. Um, so I would say that, but then also like when we talk about hero and villain, there's a struggle, right? A human struggle, resilience, triumph. We talk about this in Beethoven 5 and even in Tchaikovsky 5 that we have done. It's here is also, a path or a narrative that goes, you're not the same person at the end of the symphony that you were at the beginning. Also, the second movement is a funeral march. That's very rare. That often gets done for like state funerals. It's kind of a lengthy movement, but sort of very introspective and very deeply personal. So it's just a wonderful symphony. It's a real departure from what came before, and you feel the newness every time I do it.
This actually, I mean, again, legendary, was Beethoven's favorite symphony of his own symphonies that he wrote.
Really, did not know that.
But I think you mentioned the introspective quality. Beethoven was certainly at an introspective time in his life. Um, a year or two before he wrote this work, he really started to publicly acknowledge his increasing deafness, which he had tried to ignore. I mean, he had tried to treat it, but I think, obviously as a world famous composer and pianist, there was just so much shame, personal shame, social shame, self-questioning with this deafness. I mean, how do you compose? How do you play as a pianist if you can't hear what you're doing? So he had written a really famous letter, very introspective. Was really struggling with, he had so much more to say. He was actually suicidal, but I think all the music that he felt he still had to write kept him from following through on that. So you mentioned that the introspective personal struggle. You really hear that in this work much more than in his first or second symphonies. Um, that really long funeral march. And then there's also there's a lot of humor in this as well. I mean, the fourth movement begins with this crazy key that doesn't fit at all. If you're a music theory person, and then it's basically this long set of theme and variations, but he doesn't even get to the theme. After this crazy mad dash of an opening, he just has this bass line for a while, and people who are used to, audiences who are used to these strong, striking fourth movements and, strong introductions to fourth movements would have been just scratching their heads. Not only would they have thought the symphony should have ended about 15 minutes earlier, they would have been scratching their heads at, what is this? So I think for all his introspective and melancholy things he was struggling with, he also perhaps was thumbing his nose at some things too, and having a little bit of fun. Yeah, the comments from that first performance were just scathing. The critics did not know what to do with this. Some of those will be in the program notes, so I encourage you to read those because they're quite funny. But when we think now about the difficulty of listening to modern music, and what seems modern to us and challenging to us and hard to know how to understand, that's what this piece was to Beethoven's audience. Seems almost silly to us because it's not that weird compared to what came after it. But this was shocking music. Wonderful piece, a lot of fun to play. Not easy to play as a string player. It goes on and on. There's a certain amount of endurance we have to have, but also just making sure you don't use everything you've got at the beginning of the first movement because it's a long way to go.
As you made mention of this movie Mozart, right, where there was a lot of Salieri also, and like how those composers are different. And I often think about, if Beethoven hasn't come along, there would have been other composers who just kind of kept this tradition alive of like formulaic symphonies, they sound perfectly pleasant. But I think Mozart, great innovator, it stays traditional, but it has this divine spark where it just kind of sings off the page. Everything is lyrical. And then Beethoven also, like a great innovator who just came along and said, I'm going to do something new to form and boundaries. And, that's why these composers are remembered for their innovation. So, and number three is really a departure. I mean, I think it's the beginning of the Romantic era, actually.
Yeah, that's how most people date the beginning of the Romantic era, is with
Yeah,
this piece.
yeah. That's quite striking.
Yeah.
And then you've got this beautiful Prokofiev, that is so rarely heard, but it's something that should be done more. So I think this is a really great program, for the people who love the first concert with the bombastic, Tchaikovsky symphony and all the colors. I think this is just a great second concert where you can be a little bit more personal. It really takes you on a journey. So I think it's good variety.
It's
Not
bombastic.
necessarily just my favorite pieces, but also just
Yeah.
makes a nice season,
It's a little bit bombastic in a Beethoven sort of a way.
right?
And it would have been thinking about all the pieces we played this year and how they would have been received by their first audiences, I think Beethoven would have been the most bombastic.
Hmm.
So,
Yeah.
yes, thank you for watching. We're really looking forward to presenting this music to you on October 4th, and eager to see you then. Thank you.
Thank you.